Welcome, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Silver, and I'm the chair of the Northampton Democratic City Committee, and also a co-founder of the Take Back Our Democracy Coalition that many of you are a part of. We're delighted to host this meeting tonight about the upcoming vice presidential possibilities. I would ask that if anybody has a question, please put it into the chat. You will note that you'll only have a choice of a couple of people that you can chat to. It won't go to everyone. So I'm going to ask that you only chat questions and that you chat them to me. And I'm going to try to keep track of them as we go through, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. So I hope that's okay. We're going to keep everybody muted just so that we don't run into any background noises, but that's pretty much it. Tonight we're going to hear from Bill Scher. This is very exciting. We were hoping to get to this at our Take Back Our Democracy Summit, and we ran out of time. So I asked Bill if he would be willing to do a follow-up on vice presidential possibilities, and he was gracious enough to be willing to do this. So I'm very excited to hear about it. For those of you who don't know Bill, he's a contributing editor to Politico magazine and a contributor to Real Clear Politics. He also co-hosts the bloggingheads.tv show and podcast, and the DMZ with CNN contributor and Daily Beast columnist Matt Lewis. In 2006, he wrote the book, Wait, Don't Move to Canada, which later became an answer on Jeopardy! For nearly 10 years, Bill wrote political commentaries and managed online activist campaigns for the progressive group Campaign for America's Future. Prior to that, he was the Deputy Communications Director for the women's legal rights organization Legal Momentum, which many of you probably formerly knew as now Legal Defense and Education Fund. Bill is presently working on a new history podcast titled When America Worked, with a pilot episode set to be released later this year. Bill is a walking encyclopedia, and he's my go-to political analyst. Ask him about any race in the country, and he'll tell you as much or as little as you'd like to know about that race, as well as the larger picture into which that race fits. He is also an eternal optimist, which is something that we sorely need these days. We're lucky to have him join us this evening. Please welcome Bill Scher. Bill?
Thanks, everybody. It's a great intro. I didn't write it, so thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen for the PowerPoint slides. Is that working? I'm on first. There you go. So this is titled "Who Will Joe Biden Pick?" And I'm not going to be Karnak. I'm not going to tell you exactly who he's going to pick. I can't read his mind, but I think I can give you a good read on what goes into these sorts of decisions and going through the possibilities, how they would match up to all the various considerations that Joe Biden is likely weighing. I think a lot of the time, vice presidential tea leaves, they're fun, but they're not necessarily really important. They don't usually have a big impact on who wins. They don't usually flip states. They don't usually give us that big of a window into how a president's going to govern. You know, just because Ronald Reagan picks his moderate opponent, George H.W. Bush, doesn't mean Reagan governs as a moderate. He's still going to be Reagan. I do think that this year is a different year. Biden may only serve one term. He's 77 now. Will be 78 at inauguration, assuming he wins. So he's not going to say he's a one-termer. In fact, he even made a 8 years comment earlier this week. He doesn't want to proactively lame duck himself, but I think a lot of people assume he could be a one-termer. And a sitting vice president or former vice president, if they run for president, they almost always win the presidential primary. Now, granted, there's only so many examples we have in the modern primary era, but everyone who has tried has won the nomination, with the lone exception of Dan Quayle, who didn't really run for the presidency for very, very long. And I think Biden himself is an example. Here's someone who was a former vice president. A lot of people count it out, but there's something to being a vice president. You've been in people's homes for 48 years. People have a lot of familiarity with you. That goes a long way in a presidential primary. On top of that, the Democratic Party is ideologically unsettled. There is clearly a more robust, moderate wing than a lot of people thought going into this campaign, but there's also a very active and robust progressive populist / democratic socialist wing, and the two are coexisting for the time being, but how far each faction can grow over time is, I think, an unknown. And who that VP is, if that person's the standard bearer 4 years from now or 8 years from now, that person might have a big say in the long-term direction of the party. So a lot is riding on this pick, in my opinion. What are the factors that a nominee typically is going to consider? There are the questions about what do I need to win in November? Does that person clear the basic ready on day one test? We pick somebody who people automatically see as unqualified for the job. That's the kind of thing that might actually become a demerit. And particularly in Biden's case, people are already concerned about his age, at least some are. They want that extra reassurance that whoever might have to step in a moment's notice really is ready for the job. In addition to being ready to govern on day one, there's a question of being ready to campaign on day one. This is you're going up against Donald Trump, the consummate bully. It's a very raucous media environment. If someone's not sure-footed, right at the point of announcement, does that person become a liability? And that all kind of comes into what I think is the most important criteria of vice presidential nominations: do no harm. They often don't help you win, but they might help you lose if there is some big glaring flaw because the person wasn't vetted properly. Now, if someone could flip a state or be considered likely to flip a state, that's great. If that person could plausibly boost turnout, that's great. If they can be a really effective attack dog so the nominee doesn't have to get down the gutter, that's great too. But those things are, I would say, are bonuses, not essentials in having a vice presidential nominee. Then there's the governing question. Now every candidate is going to have a different take on it, but Biden's been pretty open with us about what his vision is, and he said he wants someone who is simpatico with me philosophically. You've got to be able to turn to your vice president, turn and say to your vice president, this is your responsibility. He was speaking about him being in this position with Obama, recognizing the job has gotten so big that the president can't do it all him or herself and needs extra help to cover all the possible tasks on hand. They can't just be window dressing. They can't just go to funerals anymore. So he wants that level of trust that if he gives that vice president a task, they're going to do it the way he wants it done. And then there's sort of the political question about being a team player while in office. Is this person going to stay on message, not go rogue? As I said before, there's already philosophical differences inside the Democratic Big Tent. Can that vice president help with party unity if Biden has to make a compromise that not everybody in the party wants to see made? Someone who can help on that score is going to be a positive in Biden's mind, I would think. So then there's the question, again, there's different schools of thought here. Should you pick somebody who's going to balance the ticket, balance it geographically, balance it ideologically so it reflects the big tent of the party? Or do you double down on the brand of the nominee and really emphasize that what this candidacy represents? Al Gore 92 was the classic double down pick. Two young, moderate Southerners, a different kind of Democratic Party than the Mondale Dukakis Democratic Party. Mike Pence was your classic base pick. Trump was still seen as not necessarily reliable ideologically by a faction of the party, particularly the evangelical faction. Mike Pence was a way to signal, hey, I'm going to be on your team. Biden himself in 2008 and George Bush in 1980, those were moderate balanced picks. The nominee was seen as more ideological. The VP was a signal to the swing voters, hey, I'm not going to go too far off the deep end. You can trust we're going to keep things on the straight and narrow. And Lyndon Johnson is the classic geographic balance pick. Kennedy being a Northeastern Catholic, you get a Southern Protestant, that will help convince Southerners to stay on board with the Democrats at a time when the South was very important to the Democratic Party. Now, all these different philosophies, you can pick any one of them doesn't mean it's going to work out for you. Barry Goldwater picks a conservative William Miller, loses by a landslide. Dukakis tries to copy John Kennedy with Lloyd Benson, gets blown out in the South. Bob Dole was seen warily by conservatives, picks Jack Kemp, still doesn't energize turnout. John Kerry goes with another Southerner, John Edwards, doesn't pick up a Southern state. So just because it makes sense on paper doesn't mean it's going to work out. And that's really because the top of the ticket is going to matter most in how these races turn out. Then there's the question about, can they flip a state? And we talk about certain candidates as being, well, this person's from Michigan, this person's from Wisconsin. That must mean that person's going to help in that state. Well, the history of that is actually not that great. Paul Ryan, everyone that was, I think, in a challenger position where they were trying to flip a certain state somewhere in the country. Paul Ryan couldn't flip Wisconsin. John Edwards doesn't flip North Carolina. Jack Kemp doesn't flip New York. Benson does not flip Texas. Farrar doesn't flip New York. Now, George Bush, Texas does flip in 1980. But is that really because of Bush? That was a landslide for Reagan where he kind of blew up the entire map. I don't know if you really can credit Bush with that. Mondale flips Minnesota in 76. I would make an argument that actually helped there, only because in 1980, Minnesota is one of the few states that they actually held. Actually, I think there was a real kinship between Mondale and Minnesota. Agnew doesn't flip Maryland, Miller doesn't flip New York, Lyndon Johnson does flip Texas. So again, very thin track record here. So if you're going to make the case that someone's going to flip a state, I think you got to prove it. You got to have real hard evidence. Just being from the state is not enough to make that case. Now, if we look at 2020 specifically, what's the specific landscape that we're working in here? Well, some people think he should have a white Rust Belt candidate because that's where the race was lost in 2016. But if you're talking about the Rust Belt, let's not forget there are cities in the Rust Belt that have robust people of color populations, and turnout there might be also important in winning those states. Some people have thought that it's not going to be a Rust Belt campaign, it's going to be a Sun Belt campaign. It's flipping Arizona and North Carolina and Georgia, maybe even Texas. And those are more racially diverse states. But there are also a lot of white seniors in those states, and Biden has shown some traction with that constituency. So that let's not forget about that factor in winning those states. And then again, there's the ideological question: does he need more young progressive voters? And if he does, what do they care about most? Do they care about having an economic populist, or do they care about racial diversity and racial justice? So that again gets to where should Biden position himself and the party ideologically? Should he have, in Biden's words, a simpatico, moderate pragmatist? Or should he have a balance with a progressive populist, or someone who can be more of a broadly appealing person reflective of a big tent philosophy? What do the polls say about some of these things? Well, depends on the wording. Suffolk poll from USA Today said 72% Democrats say a person of color is very or somewhat important for VP. That's a higher percentage among whites than it is among blacks. But you phrase the question differently, as the New York Times did. Should it not be a factor? 4 and 5 voters say it should not be a factor, including 3/4 of black voters. Now, we ask about specific candidates. You get slightly different results. So here's a poll from YouGov in early June that had Warren on top amongst registered voters, with Harris second. Abrams and Klobuchar are two folks who are really not really considered in contention anymore, getting up there. Demings, Bottoms, and Whitmer down in single digits. But then when they asked that same question to Democratic voters, Harris was a little bit ahead of Warren. And another poll, also early June from Data for Progress, this was Democrats, Democratically Independents. Harris led with Democrats in that previous poll. This one had Warren on top. And here's one that actually has Tammy Duckworth included. The previous one didn't. This is early June. Duckworth is only at 2%. Now, she was in the news a lot the last week or so. So if you ask that question today, that number would probably be higher. And that raises the question, how useful are these polls? They're very distorted by name ID. Warren and Harris ran for president. They're more known by people. Their numbers are higher. You might think a sleeper pick like Duckworth or Demings or Governor Lujan Grisham should get a hearing, that's not going to get picked up in a poll number because they're not on the news very much. And who should we look to guide us here? Do we want to hear what the swing voters have to say? Or do we want to hear what the Democratic base voters have to say? Depends on your theory of the case. If you're looking at base voters, you might have someone who polls very well because they get the base excited, but if they have higher negatives with swing voters, that might get canceled out or even become a net negative. So that becomes a very complicated calculation that polls can't easily detect. So with all that in mind, I just want to walk through some of the specific candidates and think about their strengths and weaknesses. The Atlanta mayor, Keisha Bottoms, has come up a lot after her performance following the protests after the George Floyd killing. She is arguably simpatico with Biden. She endorsed him early in the presidential campaign, signaling her comfort with the moderate pragmatist wing. When she ran for mayor, she was opposed. It was a crowded field, but there was a prominent Bernie-backed opponent of hers who did not endorse her in the runoff. She is Southern. She's African-American, could be a help with the base in turning out. The base is heavily African-American, and maybe could have a chance of flipping Georgia. And she has executive experience as a mayor. Some people think that it counts for something in this race. But having said that, she is a mayor. Mayor to VP is a big leap. Hasn't ever happened before, so that might raise ready on day one questions. She has been on TV a decent amount in the past month, but it's not quite the same level of intense scrutiny that a national figure has, so that might cause some questions if she's ready for prime time. Can someone in her position run for vice president while you're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic? Are you going to be accused of neglecting the city in the middle of a crisis? And she's never run statewide before, so again, it's always a bit of a dubious question whether anybody can flip a state. A mayor might even be a bigger question because they haven't campaigned, boundary to boundary in the state. Karen Bass is the name that's come up recently. She's the chair of the Black Caucus. She was the former Assembly Speaker in California. So she has some experience with bipartisan negotiation. She was there during their big budget crisis. She played a leadership role in the recent passage of police reform in the House. And George Will had a column touting her recently where Congressman Clyburn said Biden would not need to worry about her upstaging him because she has no aspiration to be president herself. And there was an Atlantic article that said some people in Biden's orbit think that Biden himself might be thinking along those lines and not wanting to be upstaged. I personally think that doesn't seem to sync up with me in my sense of Biden. I don't think he worries about being upstaged. And I think a lot of Democrats want the VP to be a woman of color precisely so that person is queued up to be president. As much as they were very comfortable voting for a white male, be it Biden or Bernie, who got the lion's share of the primary voters, I think there's still underlying guilt there, particularly amongst white liberals. And they would like to see a balanced ticket, not for window dressing purposes, but so it'd be easier to break that barrier 48 years from now. So if you're picking someone who is explicitly designed to not be that, you might get accused of being tokenist and not helping someone break that barrier. There's also the case with Bass. She made a comment when Castro died. The passing of the Comandante and Jefe is a great loss to the people of Cuba. A lot of Florida Democrats did not take kindly to that characterization, and that's come up in recent days. So if it's going to put Florida at risk, that might be a reason to pass over Karen Bass. Susan Rice is probably the most experienced African-American woman in the national security field on the Democratic side. And so if you're looking for ready on day one, she's being put in the mix on that score. And she's done a lot of national TV dealing with crisis issues. So she's not a stranger to that. However, that's a double-edged sword because she was at the center of the Benghazi scandal, to the extent you want to call it a scandal. But conservatives would have a field day dredging that back up again. And that might be a reason for Biden to pause. And she also was fairly charitable about Colin Powell's W&D presentation before the Iraq war. And that might lead to the anti-war faction of the party to criticize her as being too militaristic. And she's been high up as a national security official, never having run for office before. That's a different skill set, different level of experience. That might make you wonder if she might commit some kind of gaffe being under that kind of spotlight. Val Demings, you've probably heard, has gotten a lot of attention as of late. She is not just from a swing state, she's from a swing area in the swing state, being in Orlando. She was the former Orlando police chief. Some people think that having a law and order background would be a positive, would help with swing voters. And she did a good job as one of the impeachment lawyers that prosecuted the case in front of the Senate not too long ago. But again, House member, hasn't been in the House that long, doesn't have a bill to her name of note. The ready on day one question might still come up, hasn't run statewide. And being a police chief also very much a double-edged sword in this environment. Politico very recently had a deep dive into the police brutality cases that happened on her watch. And that would certainly come up a fair amount if she was actually picked. So if she wasn't going to be picked, she would have to at least be very skilled at responding to those questions. Or Elizabeth Warren, obviously high up on people's minds, highest profile progressive populist in the running, widely hailed for having policy depth, have run for president, has dealt with a lot of intense scrutiny on that level. Her supporters are very, very squarely in her corner, but she would be an ideological balance pick, not an ideological simpatico pick. And she did worse than Biden and Bernie in trial heats in the 2020 campaign. So she has that reputation of not being a great swing voter candidate. Would there be a risk of it energizing the base at the expense of hurting Biden at the swing? Now, she is the first white candidate I've mentioned so far. When Klobuchar withdrew from consideration, she said that Biden should pick a woman of color. That doesn't make it impossible for Biden to pick a white woman, but I do think it makes it harder. He's going to have to explain why he did that when he was getting this counsel not only from prominent African Americans, but from prominent white candidate to do such a thing. I think you'd need a really good answer for that if you were going to go down that route at this point. Well, the other white candidates in the mix is Senator Tammy Baldwin, also someone in the economic populist side of the coin, if not quite as prominent as Warren. But unlike Warren, she is one in a swing state, one in Wisconsin, and would be the first LGBT VP nominee if she was picked. But a low-key choice, not a lot of national spotlight experience, and again, as a white candidate, I think that is tricky in the current environment. Gretchen Whitmer, someone who got a lot of attention early in this process because she got into a very prominent sparring match with Trump around handling of the coronavirus epidemic that shot her national recognition. Her popularity rose back at home, but she also became more polarizing at home. And there was the only poll that I've seen of anybody that tested a VP possibility in their home state actually showed her weakening Biden's stature by 2 points. So not that necessarily mean he would lose Michigan, but it does cut against the argument that she would be a unique help in Michigan. And also like Mayor Bottoms, if you're in the middle of a pandemic, can you really be campaigning for the vice presidency at the same time without being accused of neglect? I think that's tricky. Michelle Lujan Grisham, she's the only Hispanic name in the mix right now. Only Hispanic governor in the country, has done a good job on coronavirus so far. Arizona is really spiking, and New Mexico, it is having an uptick right now. It's been very low. It's not shooting up the way Arizona is. So as of today, you could argue she has that on her resume as a positive, but you don't know what's going to happen between now and November. And so you get a spike in the middle of the campaign and it's on her watch. That's a big gamble. And here's something that's not well known at all, but not hard to find on Google. Last December, she was accused of inappropriate touching of a campaign aide. She denied it, but certainly something I'm sure the Biden people must be aware of. They have to be asking her about if she's being seriously considered. They have to be very, very comfortable that there wasn't anything to that story if she was going to be picked. And again, we should not assume that just because she is Hispanic, she is an automatic plus in the Hispanic community. That's a very diverse community. A Cuban in Florida is not the same as someone from Mexican descent in Arizona. She has a Spanish lineage. She ran against somebody in her state for the House once who had a Mexican lineage, and he accused her of playing a race card against him. I don't know if he wants to recirculate that charge if she's picked again, but we just don't know if she would unify the Latino community around her candidacy. if she was nominated. She could, just can't assume it. Tammy Duckworth, getting a lot of attention very late. Always been a very powerful biography as a WAMPUT Purple Heart recipient who fought in the Iraq War. Of the Midwesterners in the range, she's the only person who's not white. She is, her mother was Thai and of Chinese descent. And after she committed an arguable gaffe, answering a question about tearing down statues of George Washington, she's very forceful in her response after Tucker Carlson slandered her patriotism. That rose her stock in some people's eyes. But flip side of that is she was in that position in the first place because she made a gaffe, became a bit of a flap. Should Biden be worried that she might do that again? And she's had critics on her left before. She beat someone to her left in a House primary in 2006. When AOC broke onto the scene, she had a crack that AOC socialism was only viable in the Bronx and in Detroit, not necessarily nationwide. So some folks on the left might have some complaints if she is picked. Then you have Kamala Harris, last person we're going to mention here, sort of who I've written, who I think is very likely and has a strong case behind her. That's my bias. She's the lone Black woman, lone Indian American woman who's been elected statewide of the current lot of office holders right now. Ran for president, experience on the national stage, took a leadership role in the police reform debate. If you're going to pick a senator, there's always some risk that you might lose that seat. Even if it's not going to be up for a gubernatorial appointment, a special election is going to come down the pike sooner or later. Weird things happen. California is probably the state with the least risk of losing that seat. The Republicans are really flat on their back in that state and haven't had a quality candidate in some time running statewide. She is generally viewed as being progressive, but has a pragmatist streak, so maybe she could unify the factions to the extent that that is possible. She did hit Biden hard on the busing question in the primary, but perhaps that could be a positive, showing that Biden's willing to let bygones be bygones, no hard feelings, let's all unite under one banner. But there are, as always, there are negatives. The activist left is critical of her prosecutorial record. She struggled in the campaign to balance the appeals of the populist and the pragmatist, and ended up having some detractors in both camps. And some people think she is maybe too ambitious. Maybe she would not be a team player. That's sort of the subtext of the Karen Bass argument, that perhaps Kamala Harris couldn't be trusted to salute what she had to salute if she was gearing up to run in 2024. I personally would argue that Harris is the best do no harm pick of this lot. I think that I do think there is a healthy appetite in the party for a woman of color. And as the person who is the only statewide elected official as a woman of color, she clears that ready on day one test, both on the governing question and on the political campaigning question. So I think there's just a lot of factors in her favor. So I think you're going to see a period now where she's seen as so obvious that it's not very interesting to talk about her. That's why you get Duckworth trial balloons and Deming's trial balloons and Karen Bass trial balloons. And again, I can't be a mind reader. I can't know what Biden's going to do. But it would not surprise me if sort of the obvious pick going in, so the same way Biden was the obvious pick at the beginning of this process that people didn't quite want to accept, that she might be the slow and steady candidate that ends up getting the prize at the end of the day. But again, nothing's set in stone, lots of argument to be had. And I think whatever Biden does, I'll end on this note before I take questions, he can't pick anybody that's going to make everybody happy. It is a Big Tent party. There are people with strong views on the left side of the fence and on the moderate side of the fence. But you don't want to look at this, as important as I think the pick is, and as much of a signal as I think it will be on the future of the party, you don't want that to let you, if it's not the person you wanted, you don't want that to be something that makes you disappointed or dismayed, because it's still going to be a Big Tent party no matter what. There's still going to be room for diverse voices in the party no matter what. And the key to beating a guy like Donald Trump is to maintain unity. So whatever he does, I would always keep that front and center. So with that, I'm happy to take folks' questions.
Oh, thanks, Bill. It's really fascinating and interesting, and you've given us a lot to think about. The first question comes from Susan Triolo, and the question is, I've seen Stacey Abrams no longer seems to be in the top roster. Please speak about Stacey.
Yeah, I always thought that state. I did a ranking for Politico back in March, and I put Stacey at the very bottom back then, even when there was a lot of buzz around her. Um, as far as Ready on Day One goes, her highest rank was state assembly minority leader. I mean, you argue maybe she should have won the governor's race if things were done fairly, but she didn't. She didn't have that experience going for her. So that's a really big leap to make. And I saw one op-ed saying, well, she did the best of any of these Democrats in boosting turnout in her own state. That suggests she could help flip her state. I think that's a very thin reed to work on, based on the things that I said, previous in the presentation. And I'm not even convinced that she was really that serious about it herself. She had a book coming out. She talked about being an open, loud and proud candidate in the run up to the book publishing, and the book published, and she stopped talking about it. So I think that's where that really lied. And I don't think Biden was ever all that serious about considering it in the first place.
Okay, thanks. Interesting. So a question from Allison Cutler. How important really is Klobuchar's comment re-choosing a woman of color when she withdrew? Some saw that as a deliberate attempt to discredit Warren.
Well, it's not just Warren. I mean, I think it harms Whitmer and Baldwin as well. So I doubt there was personal animus there. Now, I think it's very possible that it was a self-serving comment. I'm Amy Klobuchar and withdrawing because not because I have a terrible prosecutorial record in Minnesota, because out of the goodness of my heart, I think a person of color should be the nominee. That might not have been wholly magnanimous on her part, but nevertheless, she said it. I think it's a sentiment that a lot of people have. And so and I think there's a high expectation for a lot of people to help women of color break that next barrier. So if you're not going to do it here, you're arguing that maybe you shouldn't do it because Warren's a very strong candidate or Baldwin or Whitmer are strong candidates, but you're going to have to answer that question. And you better answer it in a very satisfactory way, because there are going to be voices who will loudly complain if a woman of color nominee is not picked.
Thanks, Bill. And this, I think, comes from Sam Hopper. I'm not positive. I think it does. It says, could Bill speak to Duckworth's support of privatizing public water supply?
I can't. I don't know anything about it. It doesn't surprise me, because I think she's generally a moderate person. And I think if she got picked, someone's always going to find something to complain about in this world. People are going to vet the record. Things that aren't common knowledge will get dug up, and you might have to answer for those things. And maintaining the big tent, I think, is really important for the Democratic Party. It's never going to be done to perfection. Some people are just not going to vote for the guy. Some people on the far left are not going to vote for him, because they're green folks, they're independents, or what have you. And you can't satisfy every last individual person. But there are degrees, Harris, for example, has her detractors on the left, but I think her flaws, to the extent that you consider them flaws, have been aired out. They're not surprises, so that helps. You pick someone who's more of a dark horse, everything's going to be a surprise, and they might get outsized attention that they wouldn't have if it came up a lot earlier in the process. And now we're about less than 1 month out of this pick happening. So if there are things that might cause someone to be unnerved, if I'm Duckworth, for example, I want him out there now. I want that to be absorbed and processed now, and not shock somebody after the pick occurs.
Thank you. And the clarification was, that question was from Gail Fleisch, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Gail, I'm sorry, but it's Fleischhacker, but maybe I got that wrong. Who has another question about, could Bill speak of Barbara Lee as potential VP pick? And then, yeah, so that comes from Gail as well. And again, everybody, if you want to ask a question, please chat it to me, not to Sam or anybody else. When you go down to the chat place, you can do the drop-down menu and find me there. So,
one of the interesting things about all the people of color, all the women of color on the list that I mentioned, none of them you would call capital P progressives. They all have had some kind of friction with the activist left at some point. Slight exception with Karen Bass, but nevertheless, but she was someone who pushed back on defund the police just very recently, in the past month. Barbara Lee is one of the most prominent African American progressives in Congress right now. And so if you want that, and you also want there to be a racially balanced ticket, she makes sense for you. I just have not seen any indication that Joe Biden, and all the VP articles that have been written, although they claim that they know who is being considered, her name has not been in any of those articles. And we're getting pretty far down the line in this process. So if it ended up being her, it would be very much a big surprise, because she hasn't been bandied about. But that would be the argument for her. If you think you need ideological balance and racial balance, she makes a lot of sense.
Thanks. Thank you. From Michael Dover, the question, is there anyone you think would be a truly bad choice?
Well, I think, you got to meet the ready on one test, in my opinion. I mean, that's first and foremost. I worry about mayors. I worry about people who have not been governors or senators. I mean, a house is better than a mayor, but it's still a little dicey, in my opinion. I just think you want there to be no question when you have a nominee who is 78 years old. You want there to be a hint of chatter about that. So that would worry me.
Okay. So you sort of alluded to this just now, but the question from Susan Newton is, when should Biden name his choice?
I don't think a particular day matters. I think vetting matters. Don't screw up your vet. That to me is the most important thing. I would not want a rush job where you end up having a surprise. I mean, as people noted, if you rushed out with Amy Klobuchar before George Floyd, that would not have been very helpful to him. So there's a lot of argument for biding your time, making sure all your T's are crossed and I's are dotted. He's already beating Trump by 8 to 10 points in the poll averages. He's not in any kind of desperate need to have a game changer here. So you really can go up until the very edge of when the convention, such as it's going to be a convention, is going to happen in mid-August, without there being any real problem or concern for him.
Thank you. From Allison Cutler, which top tier candidate do you see as having the least ghosts in the closet?
Yeah, that's always a hard question, because you don't know what you don't know. I mean, like, to my mind, Kamala makes a ton of sense on paper, but there could be something really nasty that I don't know about that Biden does, and that would be a very good reason not to pick her. So Kamala and Warren went through the presidential primary process. There were a lot of articles written about them. If there was something a bit under the surface, I think we would have known by now. I mean, of course, things still pop up about Biden. Things still pop up about Obama sometimes. So it's not like you can be totally sure. But they've got a pretty good scrub. Whereas, Demings, we just had the first police brutality story on Demings this past weekend. We haven't had a good Duckworth vetting story yet. We haven't had a Baldwin vetting story yet. Those things are going to come either before the pick or after the pick. You want them before the pick, in my opinion, so you know what you're dealing with. I mean, it's one thing for Biden to know about them personally, but if there is something that might be a little iffy, you want it out there, you want it known, you want to see how the candidate addresses it and deals with it and contains it, if they can contain it. No surprises, as much as possible. That's my creed.
Thanks. There are two sort of related questions here. One is both about Warren. One from Robin Nardi. Sorry. So Warren, since she's white, is she out of the running as a serious choice for VP? And then from Susan Triolo, is Warren a type of lightning rod like HRC that people just don't like her, too bossy, too outspoken? Kind of related.
I don't think she's out of the running. I mean, just based on reporting, she's not out of the running. She is being vetted. I would imagine she gets the full vet. And I think she has done well in this Veep stakes period. She's been a good team player. She has continued to be a leader on various issues. And she clearly has a very strong chorus of supporters that are out there stumping for her. So if Biden thinks that I need to shore up that base to make sure they turn out on election day, the argument can still be made. And there's an op in the Washington Post today saying that she would be the best candidate for the advancement of Black interests because her policies geared towards people of color are so strong. I mean, so the argument can be made. I do think it is trickier to make the argument because of what has transpired. But you just need to think that through. If I am going to roll out a white nominee, how am I going to answer that question in a way that makes the various people in the party that really want a person of color not too deflated? Well, the other question was about the polarization aspect. I mean, I do think that is a demerit on her record. I mean, she has been through this grind, and I mean, whether it is gender related or not, I can't say for definitively. But it's just the fact that she worse versus Trump than did Biden or Bernie. So it's not strictly an ideological question why that was the case. You could say it's gender. You could say it's because she had a hard time with the single payer question, how she answered that in the course of the primary that made people nervous. I can't say for certainty, but if you're picking her, you're making a calculation that Joe Biden, can get the swing myself, and Warren is not going to prevent me from doing that. She is not the secret sauce to getting the swing. She would be help with increasing base turnout, and you have to then hope she doesn't hurt you with the swing that Biden's being the top of the ticket is sufficient to cover that base.
Okay, thank you. Sean Newman asks, my question is, how important do you think it is to Biden for the VP candidate to have run for president before? You've kind of answered this, but
yeah. But I mean, Biden has said it matters. Biden said it was a very important factor to consider. He didn't say why he said that, but he did say it. And I think it's because if you go through that process, you have gone through the process of figuring out your position on almost every possible issue. You've weighed all sorts of factors in the course of doing that. You've had interview after interview after interview, debate after debate after debate. You know what this kind of pressure and scrutiny is like to the best one can without being president yourself. So I think that is a help in having a candidate who is going to be able to hit the ground running on day one. Now, there are other examples in history where it's not that important to hit the ground running on day one. You could have someone who's kind of a background person, low-key figure, and you forget about him or her as soon as she's picked, and you move on with the campaign. I don't think this is that kind of pick in this kind of race. So I do think it's going to be a help for the two people who are in that boat, Harris and Warren, to have gone through that process.
Thanks. A question from Jane Fleischman and Joan Tabachnik. Given that Biden had such a bromance with Obama, how would this fly with a woman as VP, especially given his touchy reputation?
I mean, I assume it's a question of how, whether it's a question of their personal chemistry or a question of how it looks to the public. I can try to answer both. Biden is someone who has always had women in his Senate staff and women in his inner circle. So I don't think he has a personal discomfort with having women close to power and sharing power. And I'm sure there are people who are going to, make comments and spread memes and chop up video clips to make Biden look like he's excessively handsy. If Biden ever, put his arm around his VP's shoulder in some way, people might make cracks. But the Trump campaign's been doing that stuff for a while, and it hasn't mattered. I don't think that is proving to be a serious vulnerability for him. I think there are enough people who have testified on his behalf, who have vouched for him, who have helped with that. And there are people who I think on the left who think he is problematic in the way and just said, I don't care. I got to be Trump and I'm going to suck it up and deal with it. Whichever the thing is, he's in a good place despite people saying he has that kind of reputation.
I'm not going to add my 2 cents to what I'm thinking there, even though I do have the mic right now. Okay, so let's see. There's a couple of more Warren questions. Judy Eskin asks, is it a problem that Warren is another Easterner and seen as elite? And then wouldn't it be, and I think there was another one earlier about this also, about saving Warren for Secretary, I can't remember what somebody suggested, Secretary of something, but then also this last question is, wouldn't it be a waste of Warren's talents? She's a policy wonk. Presidents don't write policy. VPs definitely don't, do they? So that's from Amal Harak.
Well, I mean, all those questions. I mean, I think Warren has a role in the party no matter what. I mean, I think everyone respects her policy chops, and I think Warren has shown to be a good, not just a good policy architect, but a good policy advocate. She worked the system well to get the CFPB up and running to become an actual reality, and I think that's the role she wants to play. I mean, obviously, if you're VP, that might give you the inside track, but it's not the only way to be a good policy advocate. You can be a policy advocate inside the cabinet or be a policy advocate as a senator. I think she'd be a shortlister for Treasury. I think she'd be a shortlister for AG. And maybe even be better in those positions than, I mean, VP, you're somewhat at the mercy of the president. You do what the president wants you to do. You don't really have your own fiefdom as VP. If you're AG, you can go lock people up on your own. You know, that's a lot of unilateral power to have. So if I was Warren, that's what I would have gotten for myself. But I do think if you are a Warren fan, you don't have to think, oh, she's being frozen out because she's not VP. There's a lot of opportunities for Warren to play an outsized role in the shaping of policy, whether she's VP or not.
Thank you. Allison Cutler asks, and this is the second to last question we have, so if you have any questions, get them up. Going back to timing, in order to get mail-in ballots printed, shouldn't he announce sooner rather than later? Also, then the party can begin to coalesce around the final ticket.
I don't think it matters in terms of, ballot printing, because I don't think they go ahead with the printing until the convention happens anyway. They have to have a legally formal nominee before the ballots get printed. So I don't think it's a mail-in issue. And if there was some indication of difficulty in coalescing, I think you'd have a stronger argument for that. But right now, I mean, Quinnipiac poll today had Biden up by 15 points. The consolidation is not a problem at the moment. The challenge is keeping that. Right now you have both the Democratic base pretty energized and the swing vote swinging Biden's way. The challenge is maintaining that, not generating it. And so where there's risk in have, I mean, once you get more specific about anything, specific nominee, specific policy position, the more detailed you are, the harder it is to maintain a big tent. That's the challenge. That's what he has to worry about, making sure he is, I mean, and maybe some narrowing is inevitable. Maybe it's impossible to maintain a 15-point lead between now and November as things do get more specific. But you obviously want to minimize the narrowing as much as possible. And so making sure you have scrutinized this possibly as much as possible to avoid any kind of erosion, that is what I think is the best use of his time right now.
Thank you. From Christina Maxwell, what do you think the calculus is between Warren holding a Senate seat versus becoming vice president or a cabinet pick?
Is that in terms of risking the seat itself?
I'm not sure. Christina, can you clarify? I think probably just what would be the thought process as to whether she would be more effective in the Senate or VP or cabinet.
Well, I'll say this. I mean, it's not going to be easy to govern for Joe Biden. I mean, right now, there's a legitimate chance for a huge blue wave that nets you, 7, 8 Senate seats. That still doesn't get you to 60. That puts you in the mid 50 range. Now, there's obviously a lot of chatter whether he's going to eliminate the filibuster or not. Even that's not a given. You might very easily have moderate senators who will be very uncomfortable eliminating the filibuster. Because they have to answer to a lot of Republican and purple voters in their own states who don't want there to be a partisan presidency. They might accept Biden because they think he's going to be a bipartisan president. So the challenge of maintaining the middle and maintaining the left while president in the middle of a crisis where there's big needs and big concerns, that's going to be very tough and largely hashed out in the Senate. So any individual senator is going to wield a lot of power. A moderate senator could easily say, this doesn't get passed without my okay. And a populist progressive might say, this doesn't get passed without my okay. So there's certainly a lot of power to be held by any individual senator. It's certainly one with a national platform as a Warren. I mean, a Warren can raise her hand and say, this is not good enough for me. and that could kill the whole bill, just as much as a Joe Manchin could say the same thing. I don't think it is a bad place to be in the Senate if you want to shape policy. That they're going to shape a lot of policy.
Thanks. I think that's really interesting. And Christina also clarifies to say, yes, what if we lose the seat, especially because we have a Republican governor? And that's a consideration not just for Warren, but some of the other folks too, where the Republican governors may have a say or may not, depending on the legislature in the replacement.
I should have all of my Senate vacancy state knowledge at the tip of my tongue, and I looked it up. I looked it up like 2 weeks ago, and I trying to remember. I know, if I recall, I think in Massachusetts, this legislature gets to have a say in it now. Like they passed some law.
They go back and forth. They go back and forth depending on whether or not the governor is a Republican or a Democrat.
Right,
but,
right. And I forget where it currently stands.
Change on a hat, on a dime. Right. Yes.
But I think it is that the special has to happen in short order in Massachusetts, so the governor doesn't get to pick the interim, or maybe there's a way that Warren could resign away early enough that it would be it's something like that.
It's a consideration.
So I apologize for not having it exactly correct in advance of this discussion, but I think in any event there would be a special, and that special, as you know from Scott Brown, can go either way, even in a blue state. Weird things can happen. It's always a bit of a chance to take on a sitting senator and leave that seat open when every Senate seat might count in being able to pass your agenda. So it is a factor to consider.
Thank you. All right, we're going to take just a couple more questions and then we'll have the wrap-up question. There's one here. Does Biden need a pit bull to go against Trump, or can he handle that himself?
You know, I had a piece in 2016 where I made the case for Al Franken to be VP. And I stand by that case. I thought he could have gone after Trump in a humorous way that sort of met the absurdity of the moment and would have left Hillary able to kind of be more above the fray. Instead, Hillary was the one who was throwing the roundhouses, and Tim Kaine was the guy who was being the nice guy. And I generally think it's better to have your number two, throw the punches. But in this case, so much of Biden's premise is, let's get past this ugliness. Let's unite as a country again. We don't need to be like this. We don't need to be at each other's throats. We don't need to be this polarized. I do think it's a risk of being discordant if the VP is being that rough. Then there's times and places, of course. Biden says these things about Trump too. You can't be meek in front of all the things that Trump is doing. But I do think you have to walk a pretty fine line to be surgical on those attacks and not be charged with being another cycle of polarization when Biden is pledging to end the cycle of polarization.
Okay. And I did get a clarification from Representative Dom that the special has to happen quickly, but the governor gets to choose. So we'll see.
You might lose. I think there was some argument that maybe if the pick happened early and Warren resigned early, that would expedite the process. And maybe that deadline might have passed to have it be super quick. So you might have some period of time where you might have some Republican in that seat, and that might be a very critical time. That first 100 days time when you want to pass something really big in response to an economic crisis.
Okay. Bill, this is fantastic. Thank you so much. We have final questions, and there are two questions that basically say the same thing. Liam Hurley says, question for Bill and me, how can we on this call help best with November? And a similar question at the end from Joanna Bogan, what can we do to make sure Biden wins? You want to start?
I'll start. I'm sure you have a lot to say on the subject too. Some people look at the polls and say, don't look at the polls, don't get complacent, run like you're 10 points behind, all that kind of stuff. And I say, look at the polls. Polls are for real. Polls are not bad instruments. Obviously there are some duds along the way in history, but by and large, they've been pretty accurate, and there are a lot of them, and they're all pointing in the same direction. They are telling us that the public is turning away from Trump. They're souring on him. There has never been an incumbent, there's never been an elected incumbent in the history of polling that has ever come back from a deficit that Trump is in right now. The biggest comeback was George W. Bush, which was 2.7 points. And Barack Obama came back from 1.5 points. And Donald Trump was behind 8 to 10 points right now. It's just never, and there's a reason for that. You know, you've been in office for 3.5 years. People know you. They've judged you. There's not a whole lot you're going to do to change people's minds in most cases between now and November. Now, weird things can happen. It could be that the economy goes gangbusters all of a sudden. It could be that the virus goes away and people credit Trump for it somehow. Or there's an unknown foreign policy crisis and Trump does a magnificent job with it. You know, these are things I'm not expecting. These, I feel like we know who this guy is and he's not going to change his stripes all of a sudden. But, you know, I'm not arguing to you that it's a lock that Biden wins. What I'm saying is it's a fact that Biden is winning because people are very unhappy with Trump's performance and are comfortable with the tone that Biden is giving them. So the question is, in that environment, what should you do with yourself? Don't sit at home and do nothing. You want to drive this wave. You want a big blue wave. You want Biden to win by a lot. You want to break the back of Trumpism. You want to win it back as many Senate seats as possible. So that means you want Biden to have a lot of money, so he doesn't have to choose between states. I mean, he has a little ad buy in Texas right now. Texas has 20 media markets. I mean, he is arguably winning Texas right now, but by a little bit. It's going to take money to be present in that state. And Florida, where she is spending it now, is also an enormously expensive state. You don't have to. You don't want to choose between the states. You don't have to. The more money he has, less he's got to choose. And as far as like personal time is concerned, I would say where you can travel, where you can phone bank. I mean, the fact that it's possible to spread the map means you don't have to be as choosy about where you spend your time. I mean, the low-hanging fruit is still important. You know, Maine, Colorado, Arizona, North Carolina are going to be the lowest hanging fruit Senate states. Those are very critical. But you're starting to see Montana and Iowa and Georgia. And we'll see what happens in Texas now that primary is over, if that becomes more competitive. Kansas also could be very competitive. There's a real chance here to win in these places. So you don't have to limit yourself, limit your money, limit your time, because the data and the map suggest that you shouldn't.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to add to that before we give Bill a big round of applause and thank you. We're running 4 phone banks every week. On Mondays, we're calling into New Hampshire to make sure people know how to get absentee ballots. It's not intuitive. Sununu has blocked having an obvious reason, and you have to have a reason for getting an absentee ballot. So we're trying to educate the Democratic voters. On Tuesday, we're calling into North Carolina, which is a super state. We want to keep the Democratic governor. We want to flip that Senate seat, and we want to make sure that Biden wins. Wednesday, we're calling in to Maine to defeat Susan Collins, and now we have a candidate in Sarah Gideon. Yes, yay, thank you, Janet, I see you're clapping. She's going to be a great candidate, and we have to win that fight. And we've already identified 6,000 low propensity voters in Maine that will vote Democratic. So if we can get them out, that can be the difference in that race. And on Thursday, we're calling into Pennsylvania, which is a very key swing state that Trump only won by 44,000 votes, I believe. And that is certainly flippable as a state. Swing Left is also doing a tremendous amount of work on letter writing and postcard writing, and all of this can be found, all of these events can be found in 413stayingconnected.org. And if you want to subscribe to that, it's a monthly blast that has all of the phone banks, all of the links, all of the ways to get plugged in. Please send me an email at elizabethsilver123@gmail.com. And I will happily put you on the list. If anybody wants to volunteer, you can go to our volunteer page. You got your pens ready? We're recording this, so we'll put out a link and you'll have it also. But go to tinyurl.com/TBOD volunteer. That's Take Back Our Democracy, TBOD volunteer. And there'll be a sign-up sheet. You can sign up by the tactic that you like, whether it's phone banking, letter writing, texting, whatever it is, or you can sign up by the state that we're working in. And we can also connect you to other activities in Michigan and Wisconsin that are happening statewide. Volunteers are working on all of these different states. So there's also information in 413 Staying Connected about ways that you can donate to candidates that have been vetted and races that have been vetted, where your money will have the most impact for anybody that has questions about where's the best bang for your buck. Our local Swing Left group, Swing Left Pioneer Valley, has a couple of funds, Senate fund and a presidential fund, and they don't give during primary season, but as soon as we have a candidate, like now we do in Maine, the money gets released that has been raised for that. And Force Multiplier is another group that has also deeply vetted races and candidates and is fluid, so they know what the adjustments are. And as Bill said, when we started this back in October, we thought there were 4 flippable seats, and now we're up to about 7. And so we just have to plug in and keep working on them. So I hope everybody here will show up for some events. If you can't do that, give some money, but we all are part of this solution to this problem, and we can do it. We can do this, right, Bill?
Absolutely.
All right, Sam, can we unmute and everybody give Bill a big hand? And thank you to Sam for the technical help.
Thank you
very much.
All right, thank you. As I said, we're going to be, we recorded this. We'll have the link available. You can share it, and look to 413 Staying Connected. Thanks, everybody.